They paid just $3,000 for a crumbling 100-year-old mansion everyone said was cursed. But when the elderly couple pried up the rotted floorboards in the east wing, what they found hidden beneath wasn't ghosts or ruins. It was a secret, worth $300 million, that would shake their quiet town to its core, and prove that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is bet everything on what everyone else has given up on. Before we dive into this story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning air in Willow Creek, Arizona carried the scent of sage and dust, the kind of dry heat that made everything feel brittle and forgotten. Margaret Walsh sat at her kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg Henry had been promising to fix for 3 years, staring at a stack of bills that seemed to multiply like weeds. Electric, water, property tax on the small rental house they'd called home for the past decade. At 72, she'd imagined retirement would feel different, maybe a little travel, some peace, time with grandchildren. Instead, it felt like treading water in an ocean that kept getting deeper. "Coffee's ready," Henry called from the stove. He was 74, his hair gone completely silver, shoulders slightly stooped from 50 years of construction work that had left his hands scarred and his back perpetually sore. But his eyes, those same green eyes that had made her heart skip when she was 19, still held a spark of something unbreakable. Margaret pushed the bills aside and accepted the chipped mug he offered. "How much do we have left in savings?" she asked quietly. Henry sat down across from her, his own coffee steaming between his weathered hands. "After the water heater last month, about $8,000. She closed her eyes. $8,000. Their entire safety net, the buffer between them and catastrophe. Their son David sent money when he could, but he had 3 kids of his own and a mortgage in California that cost more than most people made in a year. "I saw a flyer at the post office yesterday," Margaret said, pulling a crumpled paper from her cardigan pocket. "Estate auction today, out on Ridge Road." Henry took the flyer, squinting at the small print. "The old Blackwood place says they're selling the property. Starting bid is $50,000. But," she trailed off, knowing how ridiculous the thought was. "But what?" Margaret met his eyes. "I was thinking maybe we could go, just to look." Henry set down his coffee. "Margaret, we can't afford. I know we can't afford it. I just want to see it. One last time before someone tears it down or turns it into condos." She paused, her voice growing softer. "I used to drive past that house when I was a girl. My grandmother worked as a seamstress for the family, back in the 30s. She said it was the most beautiful place she'd ever seen, like something out of a fairy tale." Henry studied his wife's face, reading the longing there. 53 years of marriage had taught him when to argue and when to just say, "Yes, all right, we'll go look. But just look, understand." Margaret smiled, and for a moment she looked 19 again. "Just look, I promise." The Blackwood estate sat at the end of a long dirt road that wound through scrub brush and juniper trees, isolated enough that most folks in Willow Creek had forgotten it existed. As Margaret and Henry's weathered Chevy truck rattled up the drive that afternoon, the mansion emerged from the landscape like something out of a dream or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. 3 stories of dark stone and timber rose against the cloudless sky. Victorian architecture, ornate and imposing, with a tower on the east side that leaned just slightly, as if the house itself was tired of standing. The wraparound porch sagged in places, and most of the windows were either cracked or missing entirely. Gargoyles that had once been proud now crumbled at the corners. The gardens had long since surrendered to desert weeds and wild grass. "Good Lord," Henry muttered, parking next to a handful of other vehicles. "It's worse than I remembered." But Margaret was already out of the truck, walking toward the house, like someone in a trance. Even in its decay, the craftsmanship was evident. Hand-carved woodwork around the door frames, stained glass windows that still held fragments of color, stone masonry that had withstood 100 Arizona summers. "It's beautiful," she breathed. The auction was being held on the front lawn, or what used to be a lawn before the desert reclaimed it. Maybe 30 people had gathered, most of them standing in clusters, whispering. Margaret recognized a few faces from town. Bill Patterson, who owned the hardware store, Susan Chen, a real estate developer from Phoenix, Marcus Webb, a local contractor known for flipping properties. A folding table had been set up with paperwork and a cash box. The auctioneer was a thin man in his 50s named Gerald Price, wearing a tie that had gone out of style 2 decades ago, and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Margaret and Henry found seats in the back row of mismatched folding chairs. Around them, conversations floated like smoke. "Place has been empty since 1986, someone said. Old man who owned it died right in the front hall. Heart attack. I heard it was murder, someone else whispered. Covered up by the family. My cousin tried to renovate it back in '92. Lasted 3 days before he quit. Said the house didn't want him there. Cursed. That's what it is. Everyone who tries to fix it up ends up broke, or dead, or both." Margaret felt Henry's hand find hers. "We can leave," he murmured. "Don't have to stay." But something kept her rooted to that folding chair. Maybe it was her grandmother's stories. Maybe it was the desperate hope that there was still one adventure left in her life. Maybe it was just stubbornness, the refusal to let fear make all her decisions. Gerald Price cleared his throat and tapped the microphone, which squealed feedback. "All right, folks, let's get started. Lot 17, the Blackwood Estate. Built in 1893 by Nathaniel Blackwood. 12,000 square feet, on 12.5 acres. The property is being sold as is, and I want to be clear. The structure needs extensive renovation. Foundation is solid, but everything else is questionable at best." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. "We'll start the bidding at $50,000. Silence. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. Someone. "Come on, folks. This is prime real estate. 40,000. More silence. Margaret could see Susan Chen shaking her head, making notes on a clipboard. Marcus Webb had already stood up, heading for his truck. 30,000. Gerald's voice was tinged with desperation now. "This is a 12,000 square foot Victorian mansion on over 12 acres. Yeah, a haunted Victorian mansion," someone called out. Laughter followed. 25,000? Anyone? The crowd was thinning. People were leaving, dismissing the property as worthless. Too much work, too much risk. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. Something that felt like anger or grief, or maybe both. This beautiful old house, abandoned and mocked, left to crumble because no one could see past the decay to what it had once been, what it could be again. 20,000. Gerald tried. And Margaret could hear the defeat in his voice. Her hand went up. She didn't think about it, didn't consult Henry, just raised her hand like she was answering a question in school. Every head turned. The remaining crowd stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "We have 20,000 from the lady in the back," Gerald said, surprise evident in his tone. "Do I hear 25? Nothing. 15,000. Still nothing." People were looking at Margaret, with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. One woman actually shook her head slowly, mouthing, "Don't do it." "Going once," Gerald said, his gavel raised. Margaret felt Henry's grip tighten on her hand. She couldn't read his expression, but she didn't let go of his hand either. "Going twice." Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Sold to bidder 47 for $20,000. The gavel cracked like a gunshot. The sound echoed across the empty lawn, and Margaret realized what she'd just done. $20,000, more than twice their savings, for a house that might fall down around their ears, for a property everyone else had deemed worthless. As the crowd dispersed, shaking their heads and whispering, Bill Patterson stopped beside their chairs. He was in his 60s, had known Henry for 40 years. "Henry, Margaret," he said carefully. "You sure about this?" "No," Henry admitted. "Not even a little bit." Bill's expression softened. "Well, if you need any supplies, you know where to find me, and I'll give you the contractor's discount." After he walked away, Margaret finally turned to face her husband. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what came over me. I just couldn't let it die." Henry finished. "I know. I saw your face." He stood, pulling her up with him, his knees cracking in protest. "Come on, let's go see what we just bought." They approached Gerald's table, where paperwork was spread across the surface, like evidence of a crime. "Congratulations," Gerald said, though he didn't sound congratulatory. "I need to be honest with you folks. The 20,000 covers the property, but there are back taxes owed, liens, some fees the county tacked on. Final price is going to be closer to." He did some quick math on a calculator. $2,800. Margaret blinked. "I'm sorry. Did you say 2,800? "Yes, ma'am." The 20,000 was the starting bid, but with no competition and the condition of the property, we're settling at actual value, which is next to nothing. Add in the back fees, and you're looking at 2,800 total. Margaret and Henry stared at each other. $2,800. Less than a decent used car. Less than the water heater that had just died. For 12,000 square feet and 12 acres. "There's got to be a catch," Henry said. Gerald shrugged. "The catch is the house itself. Like I said, 3 previous buyers tried to renovate. All of them quit within weeks. Lost money. Lost time. One guy claimed he lost his mind. He pushed the papers toward them. If you want to back out, I understand. No hard feelings." Margaret picked up the pen. Her hand shook slightly as she signed her name. Margaret Ann Walsh. Henry signed below her. Henry James Walsh. Their signatures looked small and insignificant on the official documents. "You folks are either very brave or very crazy," Gerald said, stamping the papers. "Time will tell which." He handed them a large brass key, old and tarnished. "Property is yours as of this moment. Good luck. You're going to need it." As they walked back to the truck, key heavy in Margaret's pocket, she looked up at the mansion. Sunlight caught the remaining stained glass, throwing colors across the stone. Deep blues, bloody reds, golden yellows. For just a moment, she could imagine what it had looked like in its prime. Grand, elegant, loved. "What have we done?" Henry asked quietly. Margaret took his hand. "Something stupid or something wonderful. Won't know until we try." The following Saturday, they arrived at dawn with a truck full of cleaning supplies, basic tools, and enough courage to at least walk through the front door. The morning light painted everything in shades of gold and shadow, making the mansion look almost welcoming. The front door was massive, solid oak, with an iron knocker shaped like a lion's head. Margaret slid the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly, almost too smoothly for a house supposedly abandoned for decades. "That's odd," Henry murmured. "Lock shouldn't work that easy after all this time. Maybe someone's been maintaining it," Margaret suggested, though that raised more questions than it answered. The door swung open with a groan that echoed through empty rooms. Stale air rushed out, carrying the scent of dust, old wood, and something else, something floral and faint, like dried lavender. They stepped inside together, their footsteps loud on the hardwood floor. The foyer stretched before them, grand and ghostly. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, half its crystals missing, the others coated in grime. To the left, an archway opened into what had been a formal parlor. To the right, a library with empty built-in shelves. And straight ahead, a staircase that curved up to the second floor, the banister carved with intricate patterns of leaves and vines. "Look at this woodwork," Margaret breathed, running her hand along the banister. "Henry, this is all hand-carved. Do you know how much this would cost today?" Henry was testing the stairs, one careful step at a time. "Solid, no rot that I can feel." He looked up at the ceiling, at the plasterwork that had somehow survived. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. They spent the morning exploring the first floor. The parlor had a fireplace large enough to stand in, its mantel carved from a single piece of marble. The library's shelves were empty, but the wood was bird's eye maple, rare and expensive. The kitchen was ancient, no modern appliances, just a massive cast-iron stove and a stone sink. But the bones were good. A hallway led to what had been a conservatory. Windows on 3 sides, most of them broken now, letting in desert wind and dust. But Margaret could imagine it filled with plants, light streaming through repaired glass, a place of growth and green. "We could fix this," she said, more to herself than to Henry. "Couldn't we? And a does, Lars. We couldn't we?" He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We could try. Take it slow, one room at a time." By afternoon, they'd made it to the second floor. This was where the real damage showed. Water stains on the ceiling from a roof that had leaked for years. Wallpaper peeling in long strips like dead skin. Several doors were stuck shut. Wood swollen with humidity, despite the desert climate. Henry worked on one of the stuck doors, while Margaret explored the rooms that were accessible. Most were bedrooms, empty, except for the occasional piece of furniture left behind, covered in sheets. One room stopped her cold. It was at the end of the hall, in the east wing near the tower. Unlike the others, this door had opened easily. The room beyond was completely bare. No furniture, no curtains, not even dust on the floor like there should have been, and the floor itself was strange. Margaret knelt down, running her palm across the wood. The planks were different colors, different widths, running in different directions. It looked like someone had replaced sections, but not in any logical pattern. Some boards were dark with age, others were lighter, newer. The grain didn't match, the seams didn't line up right. "Henry," she called. "Come, look at this." He appeared in the doorway, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What's wrong?" "The floor. Look at it." Henry knelt beside her, his experienced contractor's eyes scanning the planks. He knocked on one with his knuckles. The sound was different from the solid thunk of regular flooring. Hollow, empty. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Why would someone tear up a perfectly good floor and replace it like this? No pattern, no logic." Margaret pressed on different boards, testing them. Most were solid, nailed down tight. But in the corner, near where the tower wall met the main structure, one board shifted slightly under her hand. "Feel that?" she said. Henry pressed on the same spot. The board moved, just barely. He pulled out his pocket knife and worked it into the seam along the board's edge. The wood was newer than the rest, less weathered. He pried gently, and the board lifted with surprising ease. Beneath it, instead of the subflooring or insulation they expected, there was darkness, a space, a gap. Margaret grabbed her flashlight from her pocket and aimed it into the opening. The beam disappeared into a void, much larger than should exist between floors. "There's something down there," she whispered. "Henry, I think there's a room." He was already pulling up more boards. They came away easily once he found the right sequence, like someone had designed them to be removable. Within minutes, they'd exposed an opening about 3 feet square, and below it, disappearing into shadow, were stone steps. The air that rose from the opening was cold, impossibly cold for an Arizona afternoon. It smelled of stone and age and something else, something that made the hair on Margaret's arms stand up. Not decay, not death. Something preserved, protected, waiting. "We should get a better flashlight," Henry said. "Maybe come back tomorrow with proper equipment." But Margaret was already lowering herself through the opening, her feet finding the first stone step. "Just a quick look. I need to see." "Margaret, wait. I'll be careful. Just hold the light steady." The steps were narrow, steep, carved from the same dark stone as the mansion's foundation. Margaret counted them as she descended. 1, 2, 3. The air grew colder with each step. 4, 5, 6. She could see her breath now, silver clouds in the flashlight beam. 7, 8, 9. At the 12th step, the space opened up. She stood at the threshold of a room carved into the bedrock beneath the house, roughly 15 feet by 20 feet. The walls smooth stone, the ceiling reinforced with thick wooden beams. And against every wall, stacked carefully, methodically, dozens of them. Maybe 40, maybe 50. Each one carefully constructed, sealed with what looked like wax around the edges, and on the front of each crate, burned into the wood in elegant script, were labels. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the nearest one. Collection A. Items 1 through 15, 1899. Margaret. Henry's voice echoed down from above. "What do you see?" She couldn't answer, couldn't form words. She just stood there in the cold, dark space, surrounded by crates that had been hidden beneath floorboards for over 100 years, and felt the weight of something enormous pressing down on her. Whatever was in these boxes, someone had gone to incredible lengths to hide it, to protect it, to keep it secret for a century, and now it was hers. "Henry," she finally called up, her voice shaking, "I think you need to come down here. Right now." She heard him mutter something, heard his knees crack as he maneuvered himself through the opening. His descent was slower than hers, more cautious. But when he reached the bottom and swept his flashlight around the room, he froze. "What in the hell is this?" Margaret approached the nearest crate. It was about 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, a foot deep. The wood was old but solid, the craftsmanship excellent. Whoever had built these crates had known what they were doing, had cared about protecting whatever was inside. "Help me open one," she said. Henry hesitated. "Margaret, maybe we should. Please, I need to know." They worked together, Henry using his pocket knife to pry at the sealed edges. The wax had hardened over the decades, making it difficult, but not impossible. Finally, with a crack that sounded too loud in the underground space, the lid came free. Inside, nested in straw, and what looked like silk cloth, were paintings. Not prints, not reproductions. Original oil paintings in gilded frames. Margaret lifted one carefully, as if it might disintegrate in her hands. Even in the dim flashlight beam, she could see the quality, the brushwork, the colors, still vibrant after a century of darkness. It depicted a woman in a garden. Impressionist style. All light and suggestion and beauty. "Is this real?" Henry whispered. "I think so. I think it's all real." They opened another crate. More paintings, different styles, different subjects, landscapes that seemed to shimmer with internal light, portraits that captured something essential about their subjects, still lifes that made everyday objects look sacred. The third crate held sculptures, small bronzes, marble busts, each one carefully wrapped and protected. The fourth held jewelry boxes. Margaret opened one with shaking fingers. Inside, on velvet that had somehow stayed rich and deep, sat a necklace of diamonds and sapphires that caught their flashlight beams and threw rainbow shards across the stone walls. "Oh my God," Margaret breathed. "Henry, what is all this?" But they both knew. Not the details, not the history, but the basic truth. They had just discovered something extraordinary, something valuable, something that had been hidden in this house for generations. Something that was now, legally, impossibly, theirs. They stood in that cold underground room, surrounded by unopened crates, by treasures they couldn't begin to understand, and felt their entire world shift on its axis. Margaret looked at her husband, at the man she'd loved for 53 years, at the weathered face illuminated by flashlight beams bouncing off century-old art. "What do we do?" Henry slowly replaced the lid on the crate with the paintings, his movements careful, reverent. "We don't tell anyone. Not yet. Not until we know what we're dealing with. But, Henry, Margaret, listen to me." His voice was serious now, the tone he used when he needed her to really hear him. "We don't know who knows about this. We don't know if it's even legal for us to have it. We don't know if it's stolen or hidden or what. But I do know that the moment anyone finds out what's down here, our lives will never be the same. So we go slow. We figure out what this is, and we don't tell a soul until we're ready." She nodded, seeing the wisdom in it, even as her hands itched to open every crate, to catalog every treasure, to understand the full scope of what they'd found. They made their way back up the stone steps, their legs shaky, their minds reeling. When they reached the bedroom, the afternoon sun streaming through the window felt like emerging from a dream, or descending into one. Henry carefully replaced the floorboards, making sure they looked undisturbed. Margaret watched him work, her mind trying to process what they'd just seen. Paintings that looked like masterpieces. Jewelry that looked like it belonged in a museum. Sculptures carved by hands that had been dead for centuries. All of it hidden beneath their feet. Beneath the floor of a house everyone said was worthless. A house they'd bought for $2,800 because no one else wanted it. "We need to go," Henry said, standing and brushing sawdust from his jeans. "We need to go home and think about this." They locked up the house and drove back to town in silence. The setting sun painted the desert in shades of orange and gold, but neither of them noticed. They were both too busy trying to understand what had just happened, trying to comprehend that their lives had just changed in ways they couldn't begin to predict. That night, lying in their own bed in their small rental house, Margaret stared at the ceiling and listened to Henry's breathing beside her. He wasn't asleep either, despite his closed eyes. After 53 years, she could tell. "Are you scared?" she finally whispered. "Terrified," he admitted. You? More than I've ever been in my life." They lay there in the darkness, holding hands beneath the covers. Two elderly people who'd thought they'd seen all the surprises life had to offer. Two people who'd bought a broken mansion on impulse and found something that might be priceless, or might be dangerous, or might be both. "Margaret?" Henry's voice was soft in the dark. "Yeah? No matter what happens, we're in this together. Understand? Whatever that was down there, whatever it means, we face it together." She squeezed his hand. Together. Outside, the Arizona night was cool and clear, filled with stars and silence. Inside, two people tried to sleep and failed, their minds full of paintings and jewels, and the cold weight of secrets that had waited 100 years to be found. They had no idea that by sunrise, everything they thought they knew about the Blackwood estate would be shattered. They had no idea that the treasures beneath the floor were just the beginning. They had no idea that hidden in those crates was a story of loss and love, and a man's desperate attempt to protect beauty from a world that only saw profit. All they knew was that they'd opened a door that couldn't be closed. They'd discovered something that someone had hidden for a reason. And tomorrow, when they returned to that house with better lights and clearer minds, they would begin to understand exactly what they'd found, and exactly how much danger they were now in. Margaret woke before dawn, her body exhausted, but her mind racing like an engine that wouldn't quit. Beside her, Henry was already awake, staring at the ceiling with the same expression he'd worn the night he'd learned his father had passed. Not grief exactly, but the weight of something too big to fully comprehend. "We should go back," she said quietly. "This morning, before anyone sees us." Henry turned his head on the pillow. "I've been lying here for 3 hours, thinking the same thing." They dressed in silence, pulling on work clothes that smelled of sawdust and determination. Margaret made coffee. They didn't drink. And toast. They didn't eat. By the time the sky began to lighten from black to deep purple, they were in the truck, heading out toward Ridge Road and the mansion that had become equal parts blessing and curse. The house looked different in the pre-dawn light. more imposing somehow, like it had grown during the night. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning chill. "Last chance to turn around," Henry said. But his hands were already turning off the ignition. "We're not turning around," Margaret replied. "We need to know what's down there. All of it." This time, they'd come prepared. Henry carried a heavy-duty flashlight, the kind that could light up a construction site. Margaret had a notebook, a camera, and a pack full of supplies. They'd also brought a portable work lamp with a long extension cord they could run from the truck's generator. The house welcomed them with the same groaning door, the same stale air. But now Margaret felt like the house was watching them, aware of them, waiting to see what they would do with its secrets. They climbed to the second floor, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The bedroom at the end of the east wing looked exactly as they'd left it. Henry knelt and began removing the floorboards again, this time with more confidence, understanding now how they'd been designed to lift away. The opening yawned before them, dark and cold. Margaret could see her breath in the air, rising from below, which shouldn't be possible in an Arizona morning. "I'll go first," Henry said. "Get the lamp set up down there." He descended carefully, the work lamp dangling from a strap on his shoulder. Margaret heard him reach the bottom, heard him moving around, setting things up. Then light flooded up through the opening, bright and steady. "Okay," he called. "Come on down." Margaret lowered herself through the gap, her feet finding the stone steps. The descent felt different now, less terrifying, more purposeful. She was going down to find answers, not to satisfy curiosity. When she reached the bottom, she gasped. The work lamp illuminated the space completely, and the scope of what they'd found became staggeringly clear. The room was larger than she'd realized in the dim flashlight beam. The crates weren't just stacked against the walls, they filled every available space, organized with military precision. "There must be 50 of them," Henry said, his voice hushed with something like reverence. "More," Margaret corrected. "Look, there's another section behind those." She pointed to where additional crates were stacked in alcoves carved into the stone walls. They stood together in the center of the room, slowly turning, trying to take it all in. Each crate was labeled with the same careful script: Collection A, Collection B, Collection C. Some had dates. Some had numbers. All of them spoke of someone who had taken incredible care to catalog and preserve whatever was inside. "We need to document this," Margaret said, pulling out her camera. "Before we open anything else, we need photographs, records." Henry nodded. "You're right. Do it systematic. Every crate, every label." For the next hour, Margaret photographed while Henry took notes, writing down every label, every number, creating a crude map of the room's layout. They worked in silence, the only sounds their breathing and the scratch of Henry's pencil on paper. Finally, they stood before the first crate they'd opened the day before. "Ready?" Henry asked. Margaret nodded. Together, they lifted out the paintings, one by one, handling them with the care usually reserved for newborns. There were 5 in total. Each one made Margaret's breath catch. She wasn't an art expert, but she'd spent enough time in museums during their one trip to Europe 30 years ago to recognize quality when she saw it. "This one," she said, pointing to the woman in the garden. "Henry, I think this might be a Renoir. How can you tell?" "The style. The way the light is painted." I remember seeing something like this in Paris. She turned the frame over carefully. On the back, faded but still legible, was a small brass plate. Renoir, 1879. Henry's face went pale. If that's real, it's real, Margaret interrupted. I can feel it. This is real. They opened the next crate. 3 more paintings, equally stunning, landscapes that seemed to glow with internal light. One was signed Monet in the corner, barely visible in the flowing brushstrokes. The third crate held sculptures. Margaret lifted out a bronze figure, maybe 18 inches tall, of a dancer captured mid-movement. Every muscle, every fold of cloth was rendered with breathtaking precision. The base had a signature she couldn't quite read, but the style was unmistakable. Degas, she whispered. I think this is Degas. Henry sat down hard on an unopened crate, his hands shaking. Margaret, do you understand what we're looking at here? If even half of these are real, if even a quarter. I know, she said, but she didn't. Not really. Not yet. The numbers were too big, the implications too vast. They opened crate after crate. Each one revealed treasures that belonged in the world's greatest museums. Paintings by masters whose names Margaret recognized from art history books, sculptures in bronze and marble, ancient pottery that looked Greek or Roman, Chinese porcelain with such delicate patterns it seemed impossible they'd survived. One crate held nothing but jewelry, necklaces, rings, bracelets, tiaras, diamonds that caught the work lamplight and threw it back in shattered rainbows, emeralds, as big as Margaret's thumbnail, rubies that looked like captured drops of blood. Each piece was wrapped in silk. Each had a small card, noting its origin, from the collection of Catherine the Great, property of the French royal family, pre-revolution, ancient Egyptian, Dynasty 18. This can't be real, Henry kept saying, but his voice had lost conviction. It was real. All of it was real. By noon, they'd opened maybe a third of the crates. Margaret's notebook was full of shaky handwriting, descriptions that felt inadequate for what they were trying to capture. Henry had stopped counting, stopped trying to estimate value. The numbers had become meaningless. Untrace, untenuzern, ungeneralize, ungeneralize. We need to stop, Margaret said finally. We need to think about what this means. They sat side by side on the stone floor, their backs against the cold wall, surrounded by more wealth than they'd seen in their entire lives combined. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Henry broke the silence. Someone went to incredible trouble to hide all this. The question is, why? And who? Margaret added. We need to find out who owned this house, who built that hidden room, who stashed all this away. Nathaniel Blackwood, Henry said. That's the name on the deed. The one who built the house. Then we start there. They carefully repacked the crates they'd opened, making sure everything was exactly as they'd found it. They took the work lamp and climbed back up to the bedroom, replacing the floorboards with meticulous care. If someone came into the house, they wouldn't find anything unusual, just an empty room in an abandoned mansion. The drive into town was quiet. Margaret stared out the window, her mind churning. Somewhere in Willow Creek's small library, there had to be records, newspaper archives, historical documents, something that would explain what Nathaniel Blackwood had hidden and why. The Willow Creek Public Library occupied a single-story building on Main Street, sandwiched between the post office and a thrift store. Marjorie Keene had been the head librarian for 40 years and knew more about the town's history than anyone alive. Margaret, Henry, she greeted them warmly when they walked in. "Don't see you two very often. What brings you by?" "Research," Margaret said, trying to sound casual. "We're curious about some of the old estates around here. Historical interest." Marjorie's eyes lit up. She loved nothing more than helping people dig into local history. "Which estates in particular?" "The Blackwood place, out on Ridge Road." Something shifted in Marjorie's expression. Not quite alarm, but close. "Why are you asking about the Blackwood estate?" Margaret and Henry exchanged a glance. "We bought it," Henry admitted. "At auction. Just curious about its history." Marjorie was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood. "Follow me." She led them to the back room, where the library kept its archives. Rows of filing cabinets, shelves of old newspapers on microfiche, boxes of documents that smelled like dust and time. Marjorie pulled out a thick folder and set it on a table. "The Blackwood family was one of the founding families of Willow Creek," she began. "Nathaniel Blackwood built that mansion in 1893. He was incredibly wealthy, made his fortune in shipping and international trade. For the first few years, the house was the center of society here. Parties, gatherings, all the important people came through those doors." She pulled out a photograph, yellowed with age. It showed the mansion in its prime. Pristine white stone, perfect gardens, carriages lined up the driveway, and on the front steps, a man in a dark suit. Even in the faded photo, his eyes seemed intense, burning with something fierce. "That's Nathaniel," Marjorie said. "By all accounts, he was brilliant. Spoke 6 languages, traveled the world, brought back all sorts of treasures from his journeys." Margaret's pulse quickened. "What kind of treasures?" "Art, mainly. He was known as a collector, had an extraordinary eye, apparently. Bought paintings and sculptures from artists nobody had heard of at the time. Impressionists, post-impressionists, the kind of art that wasn't fashionable yet, but became priceless later." Henry leaned forward. "What happened to his collection?" Marjorie's expression grew somber. "Tragedy. In 1898, Nathaniel's wife Eleanor and their daughter Sarah were visiting family in Boston. There was a fire. Both of them died." She pulled out a newspaper clipping. The headline stark, even after a century. "Local magnate's family perishes in Boston fire." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "How awful." "It destroyed him," Marjorie continued. "After that, Nathaniel became a recluse, stopped conducting business, stopped seeing people, just locked himself in that mansion. Neighbors said they'd see lights in the windows at odd hours, hear strange sounds, but no one ever saw Nathaniel himself." "What about his collection?" Henry pressed. "That's the mystery," Marjorie said. "According to estate records, Nathaniel had accumulated one of the finest private art collections in the western United States, worth millions even then. But after he died in 1903 heart failure, they said, found him in his study. The lawyers searched for years and never found it." Margaret's hands had gone cold. "They never found the art. Nothing. Not a single painting. Not one sculpture. The bank records showed he'd been withdrawing massive amounts of money in the years before his death. But where it went, what he bought with it, nobody knows. The assumption was that he'd sold everything, that the grief had made him liquidate his assets. But there was never any record of sales, no auction houses, no private buyers coming forward. It just vanished. Maybe it was stolen, Henry suggested. Marjorie shook her head. That was investigated. No evidence of theft. No break-ins. Nothing. It was like Nathaniel made his entire fortune disappear. She paused, studying them carefully. Why are you so interested in this? Margaret forced a smile. Just curious. You know how it is. Moving into a new place. Want to know its history. Marjorie didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. Well, there's more if you want to dig through these files. Birth certificates, death certificates, property records. It's all here. They spent the next 3 hours going through everything. Margaret took notes, while Henry photographed documents with his phone. They learned that Nathaniel had a son from his first marriage. A son named Michael, who'd fought constantly with his father. They found letters to the editor complaining about Nathaniel's reclusiveness, about how he'd abandoned his civic duties. They found court records where Michael had tried to have his father declared incompetent, tried to gain control of the estate, and they found Nathaniel's will. It was dated December 1902, just months before his death. Most of it was standard legal language, but one section made Margaret's blood run cold. To my descendants and heirs, I leave the Blackwood estate and all properties therein, with one condition. My personal collection is to be held in trust for those who prove worthy of its stewardship. Not all things of value should be sold. Not all beauty should be locked away in private vaults. Some treasures are meant to be shared, to inspire, to remind humanity of what we are capable of creating. Any heir who seeks only personal gain from this collection forfeits all claim to it. Let it remain hidden until someone finds it who understands its true worth. Henry read the passage 3 times. He knew his son would try to sell everything, so he hid it. But where? Margaret asked. Even though she knew the answer, the house has been searched dozens of times over the decades. How did no one ever find that room? Because they didn't know to look beneath the floor, Henry said. Because whoever built that hiding place knew what they were doing. They gathered their notes and thanked Marjorie, who watched them leave with a worried expression that suggested she knew they were hiding something. In the truck, Margaret pulled out her notebook and started adding up what they knew. Nathaniel was one of the greatest collectors of his era. He accumulated treasures worth millions. After his family died, he hid everything to protect it from his greedy son. Then he died, and the collection vanished. She looked at Henry. Until we found it. We need an expert, Henry said. Someone who can tell us what we actually have. Someone who can authenticate the pieces. Who do we trust with something like this? Henry was quiet, thinking. Then his face brightened. What about Elaine Carter? You remember her from the community college? Margaret did remember. Professor Elaine Carter had taught art history at Willow Creek Community College for 30 years before retiring. She was in her mid-60s, sharp as a tack, and according to rumor, had connections to major museums across the country. You think she'd help us? Only one way to find out. They drove to Elaine's house, a modest adobe-style home on the east side of town. She answered the door in paint-splattered jeans and a t-shirt from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her silver hair pulled back in a messy bun. Henry Walsh, she said with genuine pleasure. And Margaret, what a surprise. Come in. Come in. Her living room was exactly what you'd expect from an art history professor. Walls covered in paintings and prints, shelves overflowing with books, a table scattered with what looked like an oil painting in progress. "Can I get you coffee, tea?" Elaine asked. "This isn't exactly a social call," Henry said carefully. "We need your professional opinion on something, and we need your absolute discretion." Elaine's eyebrows rose. "Now you've got my attention. Sit down. Tell me everything." Margaret and Henry exchanged a look. They'd agreed on the drive over. They had to trust someone. Might as well be someone who'd understand what they'd found. "We bought the Blackwood estate," Margaret began, "at auction last week, and we found something hidden beneath the floor in one of the bedrooms." "Hidden how?" Elaine leaned forward. "There's a sealed room under the floor, full of crates. 50, maybe 60 of them, all carefully labeled, carefully preserved. And what's in the crates?" Henry pulled out his phone and showed her the photographs they'd taken. Elaine's hand flew to her mouth as she scrolled through. Image after image. Paintings, sculptures, jewelry, ancient artifacts. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Is this real? Please tell me this is real." "We think so," Margaret said. "But we need someone who actually knows to verify it." Elaine stood abruptly. "I need to see this. Right now. Today." "There's more you should know," Henry said. "We think this might be Nathaniel Blackwood's missing collection, the one that vanished after he died." Elaine sank back into her chair. The Blackwood collection. That's been one of the great mysteries of the art world for over a century. She looked at them with something like awe. "Do you have any idea what you found? If this is authentic, if this is really Nathaniel's collection, you're not talking about millions. You're talking about hundreds of millions." The room went silent. Margaret felt dizzy, like the floor had disappeared beneath her. "How much exactly?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elaine pulled out her laptop and started searching. "Look at this. A Renoir sold at auction last year for 47 million. A Monet went for 81 million. If you have multiple works by these artists, authenticated and in good condition." She did some quick math on her calculator. Conservative estimate, $300 million. Maybe more. $300 million. The number was so large it stopped meaning anything. Margaret couldn't breathe, couldn't think. $300 million hidden beneath the floor of a house they'd bought for $2,800. "We need to go there," Elaine said, already grabbing her jacket. "I need to see these pieces in person. And you need to understand something. The moment this goes public, your lives will never be the same. There will be legal battles. Museums will claim some pieces. The Blackwood family will fight for everything. And people," she paused, "people do terrible things when this much money is involved. What happens next will turn their quiet discovery into a dangerous secret. Reveal a truth that powerful people have tried to bury for generations, and prove that some treasures come with a price far higher than money." Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. They drove to the mansion in Elaine's Subaru, none of them speaking. The weight of what they'd discovered pressed down like a physical force. Margaret kept thinking about that number. 300 million. It was more than the entire town of Willow Creek was worth. more than she could comprehend. The mansion looked different with Elaine there, seeing it with educated eyes. She walked through the first floor slowly, running her hands over the woodwork, examining the architectural details, murmuring to herself. "This is extraordinary craftsmanship," she said. "Nathaniel must have brought in specialists from Europe. Look at this banister work. This is guild-level artistry." They led her upstairs to the bedroom. Henry removed the floorboards, revealing the opening. Elaine peered down into the darkness, and Margaret saw her hands trembling. "Someone built a preservation chamber," Elaine whispered. "Climate-controlled, protected from light and moisture. This wasn't just hidden. This was meant to last." Henry descended first, setting up the work lamp. Then Elaine, more nimbly than Margaret expected for someone in her 60s. Margaret came last, closing the opening behind them. When the lamp illuminated the room, Elaine actually gasped. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the crates, the labels, the sheer scope of what they'd found. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I've spent my entire career studying art history," she said quietly, "and I never thought I'd see something like this. Never." She approached the first crate like it was sacred ground. "May I?" Margaret nodded. Together, she and Henry opened the crate with the paintings. Elaine lifted out the Renoir with shaking hands. She examined it under her phone's flashlight, studying the brushwork, the signature, the canvas itself. "It's real," she breathed. "This is a genuine Renoir from his middle period. I've seen photographs of this piece in auction catalogs from the late 1800s. It was sold to an anonymous American collector. That was Nathaniel." She carefully set it down and reached for the next one. "This is real, too, and this one. God, they're all real." For the next 2 hours, Elaine examined painting after painting, sculpture after sculpture. She took photographs, made notes, her professional demeanor cracking more with each discovery. When she opened the crate with the jewelry, she actually sat down hard on the stone floor. "This necklace," she said, holding up a piece dripping with diamonds and sapphires. "This belonged to Russian royalty. It was thought to be lost during the revolution. And this ring, Margaret, this is from the collection of Marie Antoinette. Do you understand what I'm saying? These aren't just valuable. They're historically significant. They belong in museums. They belong to the world." Margaret felt something shift inside her. Until that moment, she'd been thinking about the money, about what $300 million could mean for her and Henry. But hearing Elaine talk about history, about cultural significance, about beauty that belonged to humanity, it changed something. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Elaine was quiet for a long time, studying a small bronze sculpture that might have been ancient Greek. "Legally, the collection is yours. It was on your property, hidden by the original owner, who specified in his will that it should go to someone who understands its true worth. That's you." "But," Henry prompted, "but you need to be very careful. The moment this goes public, and it will go public, you can't keep something like this secret forever. Everyone will want a piece. Literally. Museums will claim moral ownership. The Blackwood descendants will sue. The state might try to claim it as cultural heritage. And then there are the dangerous people, collectors who work outside the law. Thieves who'd kill for a single painting, let alone an entire collection." Margaret felt cold despite the warm Arizona afternoon above them. "We're in danger," I think stands where we have in now. Potentially, yes. Once word gets out. Elaine set down the sculpture. You need lawyers. The best estate lawyers money can buy. You need security. And you need a plan for what you're going to do with all this. What would you do? Margaret asked. Elaine smiled sadly. I'd want to share it. Create a museum. Maybe. Make it accessible to everyone, not just wealthy collectors. Honor Nathaniel's wish that beauty should inspire, not be locked away. She paused. But I'm an idealist. The practical reality is much more complicated. They carefully repacked everything and climbed back up to the bedroom. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, and for a moment, standing in that empty room, Margaret could almost imagine the house as it once was, full of life and light and beauty. I'll help you, Elaine said. I have connections. Art authentication experts, museum curators, lawyers who specialize in estate law. But you need to decide what you want to do. Keep it private. Sell pieces. Create a museum. Because once you make that choice, there's no going back. They locked up the house and stood on the front porch. As the sun began to set, the desert stretched around them, endless and ancient and indifferent. We should go home, Henry said. Sleep on it. Decide in the morning. But Margaret knew there wouldn't be any sleeping. Not tonight. Not with $300 million hidden beneath their feet, and the weight of a century's worth of secrets pressing down on them. As they drove back to town in their separate vehicles, Margaret didn't notice the black sedan parked down the road, engine idling, windows tinted, didn't see the way it pulled out behind them, keeping a careful distance, didn't know that someone had been watching the house, had seen them arrive with Elaine, had seen them all go inside together and stay for hours, didn't know that by tomorrow morning, everyone in Willow Creek would be whispering about the Walshes and their strange behavior at the old Blackwood place. Didn't know that danger was already circling, drawn by the scent of treasure like sharks to blood in the water. That evening, Margaret stood at her kitchen sink, washing dishes and staring out the window at nothing. Her mind kept returning to that underground room, to those crates full of beauty that had waited 100 years to be found. Her phone buzzed. A text from David, their son in California. Mom, why are people posting on Facebook about you buying the Blackwood estate? What's going on? Margaret's stomach dropped. She called Henry into the kitchen and showed him the message. How does David know? She asked. Henry pulled out his own phone and opened Facebook. His face went pale. Because it's all over social media. Someone had posted about the auction, about the elderly couple who'd bought the cursed mansion for practically nothing. The post had been shared dozens of times, accumulating comments that ranged from amusement to concern to outright mockery. They're going to lose everything trying to fix that place up. One comment read, I give them 3 months before they're bankrupt. Said another, has anyone checked on them? Make sure they're not having some kind of breakdown. Asked a third. This is bad, Henry muttered. If people are already talking about us buying the house, they're going to start watching, start wondering what we're doing out there. As if to punctuate his point, there was a knock at the door. Margaret and Henry froze, exchanging panicked looks. Another knock, more insistent this time. Henry moved to the door and peered through the peephole. His shoulders relaxed slightly. It's Bill Patterson from the hardware store. He opened the door. Bill stood on the small porch, a casserole dish in his hands, and a worried expression on his weathered face. "Evening, Henry." "Margaret," he said. "Linda sent me over with some chicken casserole. Thought you folks might be too busy with the new house to cook." "That's very kind," Margaret said, taking the dish. "Thank you." Bill didn't leave. He shifted his weight, clearly wanting to say something more. "Listen, folks, I know it's not my business, but people are talking about you buying that place. And I just want to say, if you need help, real help, not just gossip, you know where to find me." "We appreciate that, Bill," Henry said carefully. "It's just," Bill paused, choosing his words. "That house has a reputation, and not just for being run down. Strange things have happened there over the years. People who tried to fix it up, they all left suddenly. Wouldn't talk about why. And I've been in this town 40 years. I remember stories my grandfather told me about Nathaniel Blackwood, about how he went crazy after his family died. How he was doing something in that house. Something people couldn't explain. What kind of something?" Margaret couldn't help asking. Bill shrugged. Nobody knew, but there were rumors that he was hiding things, protecting things, that the house had secrets. He looked directly at Margaret. "I'm just saying, be careful, both of you, and if you find anything strange, maybe think twice before telling the whole world about it." After he left, Margaret and Henry stood in the kitchen, the casserole forgotten on the counter. "He knows," Margaret whispered. "Or he suspects." "Half the town probably suspects," Henry replied. "We're acting strange, spending all our time at that house. Of course, people are going to wonder." Margaret moved to the window, peeking through the curtains at the quiet street. Everything looked normal. Their neighbors' houses, the streetlights beginning to flicker on, kids riding bikes in the fading light. But she felt watched, exposed. "We need to be more careful," she said. "No more bringing people to the house. No more obvious visits. We can't let anyone else know what we found." But even as she said it, Margaret knew it was too late. They'd already shown Elaine, already taken photographs, already started asking questions at the library. The secret was already leaking out, spreading through the town, like water through cracks in a foundation. And somewhere out there, someone was watching. Someone who wanted what they'd found. Someone who wouldn't hesitate to take it. Margaret pulled the curtains closed and turned to face her husband. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" Henry pulled her close, and she could feel his heart beating against her cheek, fast and frightened. "I don't know, but we're in it now, together." Outside, the Arizona night deepened. Stars emerged, one by one against the vast darkness, and in the shadows between streetlights, in the spaces where people didn't usually look, the watchers waited, patient, dangerous, ready to make their move. The treasure beneath the Blackwood estate had been hidden for over a century, but secrets that valuable never stayed buried forever. And now that it had been found, now that its existence was no longer just rumor and legend, the real danger was only beginning. Margaret and Henry had found $300 million worth of art and artifacts. What they didn't know yet was the cost of keeping it, the price of protecting it, the sacrifice that would be required to honor Nathaniel Blackwood's final wish. They were about to learn that some treasures come with a price that can't be measured in money, a price paid in fear and courage, and the terrifying choice between safety and what's right. And tomorrow, when they returned to the mansion for what they thought would be another quiet day of cataloging and planning, they would discover they weren't alone. Someone else knew about the hidden room. Someone else wanted what was inside. Someone who was willing to do whatever it took to claim it. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, jolting Margaret from a restless sleep filled with dreams of underground chambers and watching eyes. Mrs. Walsh. The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. My name is Patricia Morrison. I'm an estate attorney based in Phoenix. Professor Elaine Carter gave me your number. She said you might need legal representation. Margaret sat up, her heart already racing. How much did she tell you? Enough to know you need help. Immediately, Patricia's tone shifted, became urgent. Mrs. Walsh, if what Elaine described is accurate, you're sitting on one of the most significant art discoveries in modern history, and you need protection before word gets out. It might already be too late for that, Margaret said quietly. She told Patricia about the Facebook posts, about Bill Patterson's visit, about the feeling of being watched. Patricia was silent for a moment. I can be there by noon. Don't go to the property until I arrive. Don't talk to anyone about what you found. And Mrs. Walsh, lock your doors. The hours until Patricia arrived felt like days. Margaret and Henry sat in their small living room, curtains drawn, jumping at every sound. Henry had his old baseball bat leaning against the couch, though what good it would do against art thieves or lawyers, neither of them could say. At 11:45, a sleek silver Mercedes pulled up outside. The woman who emerged was in her mid-40s, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Margaret's car. She carried a leather briefcase and moved with the confidence of someone who'd never lost an argument in her life. Patricia Morrison, she said, extending her hand when Margaret opened the door. Thank you for agreeing to see me. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had stared at unpaid bills just days ago, and Patricia pulled out a legal pad and 3 different colored pens. Tell me everything, she said. Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. So they did. Margaret and Henry took turns, describing the auction, the first exploration of the house, the discovery of the hidden room, the crates full of treasures. Patricia took notes without interrupting, her pen flying across the page. When they finished, she sat back and studied them. You understand what you have, don't you? This isn't just valuable art. This is cultural heritage, historical artifacts. Some of these pieces have been missing for over a century. Museums, governments, and private collectors will all claim rights to various items. But we found it in our house, Henry protested. On our property, which you legally purchased, yes. And generally, anything found on your property belongs to you. But with something of this magnitude, there will be challenges. Patricia flipped to a new page. First, the Blackwood descendants, if any exist. They'll argue the collection was always meant to be family property, that Nathaniel didn't have the right to hide it from his heirs. He did have the right, Margaret said. We found his will. He specifically said the collection should go to someone who would honor his wishes, not sell it for profit. Patricia's eyebrows rose. You have the will? The actual document? Copies. From the library, archives. That's good. That's very good. Patricia made a note. That gives us legal standing, but there will still be fights. Art museums may claim moral ownership of historically significant pieces. The IRS will want to know the value for tax purposes. And then there are the dangerous elements: black market collectors, thieves, people who won't bother with legal channels. Margaret felt the room spinning. So, what do we do? Patricia leaned forward. You need to make a decision. Right now. Today. What do you want to do with this collection? Because your choice will determine our legal strategy. Margaret and Henry looked at each other. They'd been avoiding this question, this moment of truth. Quietly, Margaret spoke. We want to honor Nathaniel's wishes. Create a museum. Share the collection with the world. Patricia smiled for the first time. Then that's what we'll fight for. 2 hours later, they were back at the mansion. This time with Patricia and a small team she'd brought. A professional photographer, an art authenticator named Dr. James Chen, who'd flown in from Los Angeles, and a security specialist who immediately began assessing the property's vulnerabilities. Dr. Chen was in his 60s, with gentle hands and eyes that lit up when he saw the first painting. He examined each piece with tools. Margaret didn't recognize special lights, magnifying glasses, devices that apparently analyzed paint composition without damaging the canvas. This is extraordinary, he kept murmuring. Absolutely extraordinary. By late afternoon, they'd catalogued and authenticated 25 major pieces. Dr. Chen's preliminary assessment matched Elaine's. They were looking at a collection worth approximately $300 million, possibly more depending on auction conditions. But here's what makes this truly remarkable, Dr. Chen said, gesturing to the crates still unopened. These aren't just random acquisitions. This is a curated collection. Nathaniel Blackwood had a vision. Look at the progression: early Impressionists, post-Impressionists, the beginnings of modernism. He was documenting an artistic revolution. Patricia was photographing documents they found in one of the crate's letters, receipts, journal entries in Nathaniel's careful handwriting. Listen to this, she said, reading from a leather-bound journal dated December 1898. Eleanor and Sarah are gone. The world has lost its color, but I can still protect beauty, even if I can no longer feel it. Michael comes tomorrow, demanding I liquidate the collection to fund his debts. He sees only numbers where there should be wonder. I will not let him destroy what I have built. I will hide it all, seal it away, let it sleep until someone worthy finds it. Someone who understands that art is not currency. It is proof that even in darkness, we can create light. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. She understood now, truly understood. Nathaniel hadn't hidden his collection because he was crazy or paranoid. He'd hidden it because he loved it, because he couldn't bear to see it scattered and sold to people who only cared about investment value. There's more, Patricia said, flipping through pages. He documented everything, where each piece came from, what he paid, why he chose it. This isn't just a collection. It's a memoir, a love letter to beauty itself. Dr. Chen pulled out another journal. And look at this. He predicted which artists would become important. In 1897, he wrote about a young painter named Pablo Picasso, said he was going to change everything. Picasso was 16 years old at the time. They worked until the sun began to set, documenting, photographing, authenticating. The security specialist, a former police detective named Marcus, walked the perimeter, and returned with bad news. You've got no security system. No cameras. Locks that are 100 years old. Anyone who wants to get in here could do it in about 30 seconds. He looked at Patricia. We need to move the collection. Tonight. Before word spreads. Move it where? Henry asked. Secure storage facility in Phoenix. Climate controlled. 24-hour security. The works. It'll cost. But it's the only way to protect the pieces. Until we can arrange permanent housing. Margaret felt something twist in her chest. The collection had been here for over a century. It felt wrong to move it, like they were disturbing something sacred. But Marcus was right. They couldn't protect it here. How much will storage cost? Henry asked. Patricia consulted her phone. For a collection of this size and value, about $15,000 a month. Henry went pale. We don't have $15,000. You will, Patricia said. We'll establish a trust immediately. Borrow against the collection's value. The foundation will cover all costs until we can open a proper museum. Foundation? Margaret echoed. You'll need to create a non-profit organization to house the collection. The Blackwood Heritage Foundation. Maybe. It'll provide tax benefits and legal protection. You'll be the trustees, but the collection itself will belong to the foundation, which means it can't be seized or sold without proper oversight. Margaret's head was spinning. Non-profits, foundations, trusts. She was a woman who'd spent her life waiting tables and helping Henry with his construction business. This was beyond her understanding. But Patricia saw her confusion and softened. I know this is overwhelming, but trust me, this is how we protect what you've found. This is how we honor Nathaniel's wishes and keep the collection safe. They worked through the night, carefully packing the most valuable pieces for immediate transport. A secure moving truck arrived at midnight, unmarked and professional. Margaret watched as Renoirs and Monets and Degas sculptures were loaded into cushioned crates, her heart breaking with each one that disappeared into the truck. By 3 a.m, the most critical pieces were gone, locked in a vault in Phoenix. The rest would be moved over the following days. Margaret stood in the empty underground room, her flashlight beam cutting through the dust they'd stirred up. It's over, she whispered. Henry put his arm around her. Not gone. Safe. There's a difference. But it didn't feel like it. It felt like loss. The next morning, exhausted and running on coffee and adrenaline, Margaret woke to her phone buzzing non-stop. Text messages, calls, Facebook notifications. She opened Facebook with shaking hands and saw it immediately. Breaking. $300 million art collection discovered in Willow Creek. The article had been published by the Arizona Republic at 5 a.m. It had everything details about the Blackwood estate, about the hidden room, about Nathaniel's missing collection finally being found. Someone had leaked the story. Someone who'd been there, who'd seen. Margaret's phone rang. Patricia, I'm guessing you've seen the news, Patricia said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Someone talked. I'm working on finding out who, but the damage is done. By noon, every major news outlet in the country will have this story. You need to prepare yourselves. /trive/1/1. Prepare for what? Everything. Patricia was right. By 8 a.m, there were news vans parked outside their rental house, reporters on the lawn, cameras pointed at their windows. Margaret peeked through the curtains and saw at least 20 people, all shouting questions, all demanding statements. Henry's phone rang. An unknown number. He answered, putting it on speaker. "Mr. Walsh, this is Thomas Aldridge. I'm an attorney representing the Blackwood family estate. I'd like to discuss the collection you've illegally obtained from the Blackwood property." "Illegally?" Henry's voice rose. "We bought that property legally." "The property? Yes. But the contents? Those belong to the Blackwood heirs. My clients are prepared to sue for full possession. I suggest you return all items immediately to avoid criminal charges." "Criminal charges?" Margaret grabbed the phone. "We haven't done anything wrong. That's for a court to decide. Expect to hear from us officially within 48 hours. The line went dead. Margaret's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. "Henry, what's happening?" Before he could answer, there was pounding on the front door. Not knocking, pounding. Henry looked through the peephole and saw a man in an expensive suit, flanked by two people who looked more like bodyguards than lawyers. "Don't open it," Margaret said. The pounding continued. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh, we know you're in there. We just want to talk about the collection." More phones ringing. The doorbell. Reporters shouting questions through the windows. It was chaos, overwhelming and terrifying. Patricia called back. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't open the door. I'm sending security to your location. Sit tight." They huddled in their bedroom, curtains drawn, listening to the circus outside. Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe. This was supposed to be a blessing. They'd found treasure, found a way to honor a good man's final wish. Instead, it felt like they were under siege. "Maybe we should just give it back," she whispered. "Give them what they want. Go back to our quiet life." Henry took her hands in his. "And let Nathaniel's collection be sold off piece by piece. Let his son's descendants profit from the beauty he tried so hard to protect. Is that what you really want?" Margaret thought of the paintings, the sculptures, the journals full of passion and love for art. She thought of Nathaniel, alone in his grief, hiding treasures he couldn't bear to see destroyed. And she felt something harden in her chest. "No," she said firmly. "No, that's not what I want." "Then we fight." Security arrived within an hour. Two professionals who cleared the reporters from the property and established a perimeter. Patricia came right behind them, carrying files and wearing an expression that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "The Blackwood family's lawyer is Thomas Aldridge," she said, spreading documents on the kitchen table. "He's known for aggressive tactics and representing wealthy clients in inheritance disputes. But his case is weak. The will is very specific about worthy heirs, and the current Blackwoods, Michael's descendants, don't qualify." "How do you know?" Henry asked. Patricia smiled grimly. "Because I spent the morning researching them. Michael, Blackwood's great-great-grandson, is currently being investigated for art fraud. His daughter runs a private acquisition firm that's been accused of buying stolen artifacts. These aren't art lovers. They're dealers. Exactly what Nathaniel was trying to avoid." Margaret felt a small spark of hope. "So, we can fight them?" "We can, and we will. But it's going to get ugly. They have resources. They'll drag this out, try to exhaust you financially and emotionally. You need to be prepared for a long battle." Over the next week, the story exploded. Margaret and Henry's faces were on every news channel. Elderly couple discovers $300 million treasure. Art experts debated on television whether the collection should be in a museum or returned to the family. Online, people took sides, arguments raging about ownership, heritage, and whether two people on Social Security deserved to control such wealth. The death threats started on day 3. Anonymous emails saying Margaret and Henry had stolen from the Blackwood family, that they'd pay for their greed. Phone calls in the middle of the night. Voices disguised, promising violence. Someone threw a brick through their window with a note attached. Thieves. Marcus, the security specialist, moved them to a safe house, a small apartment in Phoenix, under assumed names. Margaret hated it. Hated hiding. Hated feeling like a criminal, when all they'd done was try to do the right thing. "I can't live like this," she told Henry one night, tears streaming down her face. "I'm 72 years old. I just wanted to fix up an old house. I never wanted any of this." Henry held her while she cried, his own eyes wet. The stress was taking a physical toll. He'd lost 15 pounds. His hands shook when he tried to eat. Margaret had stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night, jumping at every sound. "Maybe they're right," she whispered. "Maybe we're not worthy. Maybe we're just greedy old fools who got in over their heads." "Stop," Henry said firmly. "You don't believe that." "Neither do I." "Then why does it feel so wrong? Why does it hurt so much?" "Because we care," he said. "Because this matters. If it didn't matter, it wouldn't hurt." Lies. Patricia called with updates almost daily. The Blackwood family had filed their lawsuit. The state had opened an inquiry. 3 different museums had sent letters claiming moral ownership of specific pieces. The IRS wanted to assess tax liability. It was, as Patricia put it, a legal shitstorm of unprecedented proportions. But there was good news too. Catherine Blackwood, a 93-year-old woman who was Nathaniel's great-great-granddaughter, had come forward. She was estranged from the rest of the family and had written a letter supporting Margaret and Henry. "My great-great-grandfather would have wanted his collection to inspire people," she wrote, "not to enrich his son's greedy descendants. If the Walshes want to create a museum, they have my full support." Catherine agreed to testify on their behalf, to provide letters and documents showing Nathaniel's true intentions. It was a game changer. A member of the family itself saying the collection shouldn't go to the other heirs. "She's risking a lot," Patricia said. "Her family will turn on her for this, but she says she's 93 years old and doesn't care anymore. She wants to do one good thing before she dies." Margaret insisted on meeting Catherine. They arranged it quietly, at the safe house, with no one else knowing. When the elderly woman arrived, leaning on a cane, Margaret saw something in her eyes that she recognized: determination, the refusal to let fear win. They sat together for hours, Catherine sharing stories about Nathaniel that had been passed down through generations, about how he'd wept for weeks after losing his wife and daughter, about how he'd become obsessed with preserving beauty because he couldn't preserve the people he loved, about how he'd fought with his son Michael, who saw art as investment and nothing more. Michael tried to have him declared incompetent, Catherine said, tried to take control of the estate. But Nathaniel was sharp until the day he died. He knew exactly what he was doing when he hid that collection. He was protecting it from us. She smiled sadly. And he was right to do so. Look at what my family became. Dealers, investors, people who'd sell anything for the right price. Why are you helping us? Margaret asked. You could side with your family, claim a share. Catherine reached out and took Margaret's hand. Her skin was paper-thin, spotted with age. Because I'm old enough to know that some things matter more than money, and because for once in my life, I want to be on the right side of something. When Catherine left, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. Not just hope that they'd win the legal battle, but hope that they were doing the right thing, that Nathaniel would have approved. The preliminary hearing was set for 2 weeks away. Patricia assembled a team of expert witnesses, art historians, authenticators, estate lawyers. They built a case brick by brick, argument by argument. The will was clear. Nathaniel's intentions were documented. The current heirs were demonstrably unworthy by his own criteria. But Thomas Aldridge wasn't backing down. He filed motion after motion, trying to delay, trying to wear them down. News leaked about Margaret and Henry's finances, about their modest background, about how suspicious it was that they'd bought the house right before the discovery. They're trying to paint you as con artists, Patricia explained. People who somehow knew about the collection and manipulated the auction. It's ridiculous, but they're planting seeds of doubt. The night before the hearing, Margaret couldn't sleep at all. She sat by the window of the safe house, looking out at Phoenix's glittering lights, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. From struggling to pay bills, to fighting for one of the world's greatest art collections, it felt surreal, impossible. Henry found her there at 3 in the morning. Can't sleep either? I keep thinking about Nathaniel, she said, about how he must have felt, hiding everything away, knowing he'd die and leave it all in darkness, hoping someday someone would find it and understand. You think he'd be proud of us? Henry asked. I think he'd be grateful. Scared, maybe, but grateful that someone was willing to fight. Report nurse. Henry sat beside her, and they held hands while the city slept around them. 53 years of marriage had taught them the comfort of silence, the power of just being together, when words weren't enough. Whatever happens tomorrow, Henry said eventually, I want you to know, buying that house, finding that collection, fighting for it, these have been the most meaningful days of my life. I've never been prouder of us, of who we are. Margaret squeezed his hand. Even if we lose, because we tried, we stood up for something that mattered. How many people can say that? The next morning, they dressed in their best clothes. Clothes they'd bought at a thrift store because all their savings were gone, consumed by legal fees and security, and the sheer cost of protecting a $300 million secret. Margaret's suit was 20 years out of style. Henry's tie didn't quite match his shirt. But they held their heads high as they walked into the courthouse, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. The courtroom was packed. The Blackwood family sat on one side, 7 of them, all dressed like they'd stepped out of a country club. Thomas Aldridge had a team of 4 lawyers. It should have been intimidating. It was intimidating. Margaret felt like she might throw up, but then she saw Catherine sitting in the back row, nodding at her encouragingly, and she saw Elaine, who'd flown in to support them, and Patricia, fierce and focused, ready to go to war. They weren't alone. They were surrounded by people who believed in what they were fighting for. The judge entered. Judge Marianne Foster, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair, and an expression that suggested she didn't suffer fools. This is a preliminary hearing to determine ownership of the collection discovered on the property known as Blackwood Estate. Mr. Aldridge, you represent the Blackwood family. Make your case. What followed was 3 hours of legal arguments that made Margaret's head spin. Aldridge argued inheritance law, property rights, family legacy. Patricia countered with Nathaniel's will, his documented intentions, the unworthiness of the current heirs. Expert witnesses testified. Documents were submitted. It felt like watching a chess match played at lightning speed. Then Patricia called Catherine to the stand. The elderly woman made her way slowly to the witness box, and when she was sworn in, something shifted in the courtroom. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was family turning on family. Miss Blackwood, Patricia began gently. You are Nathaniel Blackwood's great-great-granddaughter, correct? I am, and you've brought documents to share with the court. Catherine nodded. From her purse, she pulled letters yellowed with age, carefully preserved. These are letters my great-grandfather Michael wrote after Nathaniel died. Letters where he admits he tried to force his father to sell the collection to cover Michael's gambling debts. Letters where he says the art was wasted on someone who didn't know its value. Patricia took the letters, entered them as evidence. And what do you believe Nathaniel would have wanted? Catherine looked directly at Margaret and Henry. I believe he would have wanted exactly what the Walshes are trying to do. Create a museum. Share the beauty he preserved. Give access to people who might never otherwise stand in front of a Monet or a Renoir. He didn't hide that collection to pass it to heirs who'd sell it. He hid it because he loved it too much to let it be destroyed. Aldridge tried to discredit her, suggesting she was senile, that she had her own agenda. But Catherine was sharp, her answers clear and damning. When she finally stepped down, Margaret saw several jurors wiping their eyes. The hearing ended with Judge Foster saying she'd rule within 48 hours. Margaret and Henry left the courthouse exhausted, wrung out, but somehow lighter. They'd done everything they could. The rest was out of their hands. That night, back at the safe house, they finally slept. Not well, but for the first time in weeks, they actually slept. And when Margaret woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the windows, she felt something she hadn't felt since finding that hidden room. Peace. Not certainty, she still didn't know if they'd win. But peace with their choices. Pride in their fight. They'd stood up for beauty, for heritage, for a dead man's dream of a world where art belonged to everyone. Whatever happened next, that would always be true. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The call came at 9 in the morning, exactly 47 hours after the hearing ended. Margaret was making coffee, her hands still trembling from another restless night, when Patricia's name lit up her phone screen. We won. Margaret's knees buckled. She grabbed the counter for support. What? Judge Foster ruled in your favor, completely. She cited Nathaniel's will, Catherine's testimony, and the documented unworthiness of the other heirs. The collection is legally yours, with the condition that you follow through on your promise to create a public museum within 5 years. Margaret couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Henry came running from the bedroom, his hair standing up in wild gray tufts. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Margaret managed, tears streaming down her face. Everything's right. Henry, we won. We actually won. He took the phone, listened to Patricia explain the details, the conditions, the next steps. When he hung up, he just stood there, staring at the wall like he couldn't quite process what had happened. Then slowly, a smile spread across his weathered face. Not a small smile. A grin that split his face in half, that made him look 30 years younger. "We won," he repeated, and then he was laughing, pulling Margaret into his arms, spinning her around their tiny, safe house kitchen, like they were kids at their first dance. They laughed and cried and held each other. And for the first time in weeks, the weight that had been crushing them lifted. The Blackwood family immediately filed an appeal. Of course, Thomas Aldridge issued a statement, calling the ruling a travesty of justice. But Patricia was confident. The judge's decision was thorough. The appeal will fail. You can start planning your museum. Planning a museum. The words sounded absurd, coming out of Margaret's mouth when she said them aloud. She was a 72-year-old woman who'd waitressed most of her life, who'd never been to college, who'd thought her biggest adventure would be fixing up an old house. And now she was supposed to plan a museum that would house $300 million worth of art? "One step at a time," Patricia said when Margaret voiced her fears. "We've already established the Blackwood Heritage Foundation. You and Henry are the trustees. Now we hire the right people. A museum director, a curator, architects, security specialists. You don't have to do this alone." But first, they had to go home. After 3 weeks in the safe house, after death threats and legal battles, and living like fugitives, they could finally return to Willow Creek, to the small rental house with the wobbly kitchen table, to the town that had watched them buy a cursed mansion and thought they'd lost their minds. The drive back felt longer than it was. Margaret stared out the window at the Arizona desert, at the sagebrush and distant mountains, wondering what kind of reception waited for them. The town had been divided by their story. Half saw them as heroes who'd made an incredible discovery. The other half saw them as troublemakers who'd brought chaos to their quiet community. But when they turned onto their street, Margaret gasped. The entire neighborhood was lined with cars. People stood on lawns, on porches, holding signs. She tensed, expecting protest signs. Angry faces. Instead, the signs read, "Welcome home," and "Willow Creek is proud," and "The Walshes are heroes." Bill Patterson stood at the front of the crowd. When their truck pulled up, everyone started clapping. Margaret opened her door to find at least 50 people cheering, some with tears in their eyes. "We never doubted you," Bill said, though his grin suggested that might not be entirely true. "Well, maybe we doubted a little, but you did it. You stood up to those fancy lawyers, and you won." Marjorie from the library pushed forward with a casserole. "Because apparently that's what you did in small towns when something momentous happened. I have all the historical documents ready for you. Everything about Nathaniel, about the house, about the art, whatever you need for your museum." "Museum?" Margaret echoed. "Well, you're going to build it here, aren't you?" Marjorie looked suddenly uncertain. "In Willow Creek? You wouldn't take it somewhere else?" Margaret looked at Henry. They hadn't discussed it. They hadn't even gotten that far in their planning. But seeing the hopeful faces around them, seeing the pride in their neighbors' eyes, she knew the answer. "Of course we're building it here," she said. "This is where Nathaniel built his house, where he hid his collection, where it belongs." The crowd erupted in cheers again. Someone popped a bottle of champagne that sprayed everywhere, making people laugh and dodge. Children ran through the gathering, excited by the celebration, even if they didn't fully understand what was being celebrated. And Margaret stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed and grateful and terrified of the responsibility she'd just accepted. Over the next weeks, their small rental house became command central for the biggest project Willow Creek had ever seen. Architects from Phoenix came to assess the Blackwood estate, determining what could be restored and what needed to be rebuilt. Museum consultants flew in from New York and Los Angeles, offering advice on climate control, security, exhibition design. Insurance adjusters spent days cataloging every piece in the collection, their faces growing more astonished with each crate they opened. And the money started flowing. Not from Margaret and Henry, they still barely had 2 nickels to rub together, but from the foundation Patricia had established. They took out loans against the collection's value, brought in donors who believed in the mission, applied for grants from arts organizations who saw the cultural significance of what they were trying to do. The preliminary budget is $8 million, the head architect announced one afternoon, spreading blueprints across Margaret's kitchen table. That's to restore the mansion, build climate-controlled exhibition spaces, install proper security, and create an education wing. $8 million. The number was so large it had stopped meaning anything. Margaret just nodded, trying to understand the architectural drawings that looked like abstract art to her untrained eye. But slowly, impossibly, it came together. The mansion became a construction site, surrounded by equipment and workers. The underground chamber where the collection had hidden for a century was sealed off, preserved exactly as they'd found it, to become an exhibit itself. The first floor would house rotating exhibitions. The second floor would be permanent galleries for the most significant pieces. The third floor would become offices and a research library. Henry, who'd spent 50 years in construction, couldn't stay away. Despite Patricia's protests that he should rest, that they'd hired professionals, he showed up every morning at 7, hard hat on his silver head, consulting with the crews about the best way to preserve the original structure while modernizing it for museum use. "This is the finest craftsmanship I've ever seen," he told Margaret one evening, his clothes covered in dust, but his eyes bright with purpose. The way these beams were joined, the stonework, the attention to detail, it deserves to be protected. Margaret spent her days working with Dr. Chen and a team of curators, deciding which pieces would go where, how to tell the story of Nathaniel's collection. They found more journals, more letters, more glimpses into the mind of a man who'd loved art so desperately he'd hidden it from the world rather than let it be destroyed. One letter, dated just days before Nathaniel's death, made Margaret sit down and cry. "I will die soon. I can feel my heart weakening. The same way Eleanor's paintings once weakened, before I restored them slowly, inevitably, returning to darkness. But I am not afraid, because I know that somewhere in the future, someone will find what I've hidden, someone who understands that beauty is not decoration. It is proof that even in our darkest moments, we are capable of creating light. To whoever you are, reading this, thank you. Thank you for caring. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for understanding that some treasures are meant to be shared." He knew, Margaret whispered to Elaine, who'd become a constant presence during the planning. He knew someone would find it someday. He had faith. And his faith was rewarded, Elaine replied, squeezing Margaret's hand. "Because it found you." 6 months into construction, the town started changing. Empty storefronts on Main Street, filled with new businesses, art supply stores, cafes with names like The Painted Cup, galleries featuring local artists. A bed and breakfast opened in a renovated Victorian house, anticipating the tourists who would come to see the museum. The high school added an advanced art program. Property values rose. Not everyone was happy about the changes. Some long-time residents complained about the traffic, about outsiders moving in, about their quiet town being transformed into something they didn't recognize. Margaret heard the grumbles at the grocery store, saw the disapproving looks, but she also saw other things. She saw teenagers from struggling families getting scholarships to art school because donors had been inspired by Nathaniel's story. She saw elderly folks who'd never been to a museum take classes in art appreciation at the community center. She saw children drawing and painting with a seriousness that suggested they were imagining futures they'd never considered before. One afternoon, a young woman approached Margaret outside the construction site. She was maybe 25, with paint under her fingernails and an anxious expression. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to say thank you." "For what, dear?" "I grew up here, hated it, thought I had to leave to become an artist, to see real art, to matter. But now," she gestured to the mansion, being transformed behind them, "now I can stay. I can learn here. I can create here. You gave people like me permission to dream bigger than this small town usually allows." After she left, Margaret stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching workers carry materials into the mansion, watching Willow Creek bustle with new life, understanding finally what she and Henry had really done. They hadn't just found a collection. They'd given their town a future. The night before the museum's grand opening, Margaret couldn't sleep. She walked through the completed galleries alone, her footsteps echoing on the polished floors. Everything was perfect. The lighting that made each painting glow like it had internal luminescence. The climate control that would preserve the pieces for another century. The security that would keep them safe. The placards that told not just the history of each artwork, but Nathaniel's story, his loss, his love, his desperate act of protection. In the main gallery, they'd recreated his study from photographs found in the archives, his desk, his chair, his books, and on the wall, the largest canvas in the collection, a painting of a woman and young girl in a garden, laughing, surrounded by flowers. Eleanor and Sarah Blackwood, captured in a moment of joy that Nathaniel had tried to preserve forever. "I hope we did right by you," Margaret whispered to the empty room, to the ghost of a man who died believing his treasures would sleep in darkness forever. The opening was invitation only, a test run before the public grand opening the following week. 500 people filled the mansion. Donors, art critics, museum directors, government officials. Governor herself came, gave a speech about cultural heritage and Arizona's commitment to the arts. Reporters from major newspapers stood with cameras and notepads. It should have been intimidating. But Margaret, standing in the foyer in a dress she'd bought specifically for this occasion, felt only pride. Pride in what they'd built. Pride in the team that had made it happen. Pride in the vision they'd honored. Patricia approached, champagne glass in hand. "You look terrified." "I am terrified," Margaret admitted. "What if they hate it? What if we got it all wrong?" "Look around," Patricia said. "Look at their faces." Margaret did. She saw critics standing transfixed before the Renoirs, saw museum directors making notes with expressions of awe, saw regular people, townspeople from Willow Creek, who'd received special invitations, standing in front of paintings with tears streaming down their cheeks, experiencing beauty they'd never imagined they'd see. Dr. Chen found her an hour into the event. "Margaret, you need to come see this." He led her to the Impressionist gallery where a crowd had gathered. In the center stood Catherine Blackwood, now 94 years old, leaning heavily on her cane, staring at a portrait of Nathaniel himself, a painting they'd found in the last crate opened, hidden away like he couldn't bear to look at his own face. "That's him," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's exactly how I remember him from the photographs my grandmother showed me. Sad, but determined. Broken, but still fighting." She turned to Margaret, her ancient eyes bright with tears. "You did it. You actually did it. You gave him what he wanted. You made his collection live." Margaret hugged the old woman gently, carefully, feeling how fragile she'd become. "We couldn't have done it without you. You risked everything to help us." "I'm 94, Catherine said with a shaky laugh. "I don't have much to risk anymore, but I got to see this before I die. Got to know I was on the right side. That means more than you can imagine." The public opening the following week was chaos in the best possible way. They'd anticipated maybe 200 visitors on the first day. Over 1,000 showed up. Families from across Arizona, art students from California, tourists who'd seen the story on the news and detoured to see the Miracle Museum. The line wrapped around the block. People waited 3 hours just to get inside. Margaret and Henry, wearing volunteer badges, worked alongside the staff, answering questions, directing traffic, watching people experience the collection. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, stood in front of the Monet water lilies for 15 minutes, not moving, barely breathing. When her mother finally coaxed her away, the girl looked back over her shoulder like she was leaving something precious behind. "Did you see her face?" Margaret asked Henry. That night, as they sat in their rental house, they'd decided to keep it rather than move into something bigger, preferring their small, familiar space. "I did," Henry replied. "I saw a lot of faces like that today. We changed her life. That little girl, she'll remember this forever. She'll grow up knowing she stood in front of something beautiful, something real." Henry pulled her close. "We did good, didn't we?" "Yeah," Margaret said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, I think we did." The first year was a whirlwind. The museum exceeded every projection. Over 200,000 visitors in 12 months. School groups came from across the state. Universities brought art students for intensive study programs. Donors continued to contribute, allowing the foundation to establish scholarship programs, outreach initiatives, traveling exhibitions that brought pieces from the collection to smaller towns that would never otherwise see them. And slowly, gradually, Margaret and Henry learned to live with their new reality. They were local celebrities now, recognized everywhere they went. Newspapers ran feature stories. A documentary crew followed them for 6 months. A publishing house wanted them to write a book about their journey. "I don't know how to write a book," Margaret protested. "Then we'll hire a ghostwriter," Patricia said. "Your story deserves to be told. It inspires people." Mighty ETs. The book, when it came out 2 years after the museum opened, was titled Hidden Treasures: How an Elderly Couple's Faith Restored a Lost Legacy. It spent 6 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Royalties went directly to the foundation, funding more programs, more scholarships, more ways to share Nathaniel's collection with the world. But the money, the recognition, the success, none of it was what mattered most to Margaret. What mattered were the small moments. The thank you letters from students who'd found their calling after visiting the museum. The elderly man who came every Tuesday to sit in front of the same Degas sculpture, finding peace in its beauty. The young couple who got engaged in the sculpture garden, surrounded by beauty that had almost been lost forever. 3 years after the opening, Catherine Blackwood passed away peacefully in her sleep. She left her entire estate, modest, but meaningful to the foundation, and she left a letter for Margaret and Henry. My dear friends, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I wanted to tell you that the last 3 years of my life were the happiest I've known. I got to see my great-great-grandfather's dream come true. I got to stand in galleries filled with beauty he preserved and watch people's faces light up with wonder. I got to be part of something good. Thank you for giving me that gift. Thank you for proving that courage and conviction can still change the world. Keep fighting, keep believing, and never let anyone convince you that beauty is less important than profit. Nathaniel knew better. So do you. With all my love and gratitude, Catherine. They held a memorial service at the museum. Hundreds came, people whose lives had been touched by Catherine's bravery, by her willingness to stand against her own family for what was right. Margaret spoke through tears about the woman who'd risked everything to help 2 strangers fight for a dead man's dream. She showed us, Margaret said, that it's never too late to take a stand, that age doesn't diminish courage, it concentrates it. She was 93 years old when she chose truth over family loyalty, justice over inheritance. And, because of her, Nathaniel's collection lives. Because of her, hundreds of thousands of people have stood in front of beauty they might never have seen. She changed the world. And she proved that one person's choice to do the right thing can ripple out in ways we can't even imagine. 5 years after the grand opening, the museum had become one of Arizona's premier cultural institutions. The Blackwood Heritage Museum wasn't just a repository for Nathaniel's collection anymore. It had expanded, acquired new pieces, become a living, growing testament to the power of art to transform lives and communities. Willow Creek had transformed too. The population had doubled, the economy thrived, but more importantly, the town had found its identity. It was the place where beauty had been hidden and found, where an elderly couple had stood up to powerful interests and won, where a man's century-old dream had finally come true. Margaret and Henry, now 77 and 79, had slowed down. They no longer worked at the museum daily, though they visited often, walking hand in hand through the galleries like any other visitors, still finding new things to marvel at in pieces they'd seen 1,000 times. One autumn afternoon, they stood in the underground chamber, the original hiding place, preserved exactly as they'd found it, now a permanent exhibit showing where Nathaniel had sealed away his treasures. The stone walls, the empty spaces where crates had stood, the cold air that still somehow felt sacred. "Do you ever regret it?" Henry asked. "All the chaos, the threats, the stress. We could have walked away, taken the money the family offered, and lived quietly." Margaret thought about it, really thought about the sleepless nights and the death threats and the weight of responsibility that still sometimes felt crushing. about how their quiet retirement had become anything but quiet, about how they'd never have another truly private moment, would always be the couple who found the collection for the rest of their lives. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret a second of it. Yes, it was hard. Yes, it changed everything. But Henry, look what we got to be part of. Look what we got to do." She gestured around the chamber. 120 years ago, a heartbroken man hid treasures in this room because he loved them too much to let them be destroyed. He died believing they'd stay dark forever. But we found them. We brought them into the light. We shared them with the world. How could I regret being part of that story? Henry pulled her close, and they stood together in the quiet chamber. Two people who'd bought a cursed mansion for $2,800 and found not just treasure, but purpose. Not just wealth, but meaning. Not just art, but proof that beauty matters, that courage matters, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe in what everyone else has abandoned. A month before their 58th wedding anniversary, they received an invitation to speak at the Smithsonian about the discovery and what it meant for art preservation. Margaret, who'd never been comfortable with public speaking, tried to decline. But Henry convinced her. "People need to hear our story," he said. "Not because we're special, because we're ordinary. Because if two broke old folks from a small town can protect beauty and fight for what's right, anyone can." So they went to Washington, stood on a stage in front of hundreds of museum professionals and art experts, and told their story. Margaret spoke about the fear, about the moments she wanted to give up, about the weight of responsibility. Henry talked about craftsmanship, about honoring the past while building for the future, about how Nathaniel's mansion had taught him that things worth preserving always require sacrifice. And when they finished, the audience didn't just applaud. They stood. A standing ovation that lasted 5 full minutes. Museum directors with tears in their eyes. Curators nodding in recognition. And in the front row, the director of the National Gallery, who approached them afterward. "What you've done," she said, "is remind all of us why we do this work. It's not about cataloging and preserving. It's about making beauty accessible. About proving that art isn't just for the elite. It's for the 8-year-old girl standing in front of a Monet for the first time. It's for the elderly man finding peace in a sculpture garden. It's for everyone who needs to be reminded that humans are capable of creating something transcendent." Flying home, Margaret looked out the airplane window at the country stretched below them. Cities and farms and mountains and deserts. Millions of people living millions of lives. Most of them quiet, ordinary, unremarkable. "We were lucky," she said to Henry, "to find what we found, to be given this opportunity." "It wasn't luck," Henry replied. "We made a choice. We bought that house when nobody else would. We looked where nobody else bothered looking. We fought when it would have been easier to surrender. That wasn't luck. That was courage." Margaret thought about that. About the moment she'd raised her hand at the auction. About prying up those floorboards. About standing in court and refusing to let fear win. Maybe he was right. Maybe courage was just another word for choosing to try when giving up would be easier. On their 58th anniversary, they threw a party at the museum. Not a fancy fundraiser or formal event, just a celebration with friends and family and townspeople who'd supported them. Children ran through the galleries in their nice clothes. not understanding the value of what surrounded them, but understanding that it was special, that this place mattered. Their son, David, flew in from California with his family. Margaret's grandchildren, now teenagers, listened wide-eyed as she told the story, the real story, not the sanitized version, from the book about finding the crates, about the threats and fear, about Catherine's bravery, about standing in court and fighting for something they believed in. "Were you scared, Grandma?" her youngest granddaughter asked. "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "Every single day, but you did it anyway." "Yes. Why?" Margaret looked around the gallery, at the paintings glowing under perfect lighting, at the people standing transfixed by beauty, at the life and purpose that filled this space that had once been empty and forgotten. "Because some things are worth being scared for," she said. "Because courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about feeling fear and doing the right thing anyway." Later, as the party wound down and the sun set over Willow Creek, Margaret and Henry stood on the mansion's restored wraparound porch. The same porch where they'd first stood 5 years ago, looking at a wreck and seeing possibility. "If you could go back," Henry asked, "knowing everything that was going to happen, would you still raise your hand at that auction?" Margaret didn't hesitate. In a heartbeat, even knowing about the death threats, the lawsuits, the stress, the Tepsines, the lawsuits, especially knowing those things, because they were part of the price, and the price was worth paying. She leaned against the railing, looking out at the town that had become synonymous with their discovery. "You know what I think about sometimes? All the other people who could have bought this house, all the developers and investors who looked at it and saw nothing worth saving. What would have happened if one of them had found the collection? Would they have shared it? Or would it have been sold piece by piece to private collectors, locked away in vaults, never seen again?" "We'll never know," Henry said. "No. But I know what Nathaniel would say. He'd say it found the right people. Not the richest people, not the most powerful people, but the right people. People who understood that beauty belongs to everyone." They stood in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge one by one against the darkening sky. Somewhere inside, their grandchildren were exploring the museum, discovering art for themselves, learning that the world held wonders they'd never imagined. "We're not going to live forever," Margaret said quietly. "Maybe another 10 years if we're lucky. 20 if we're very lucky. Probably not even that." Henry agreed. He had a heart condition now, took medication daily. Margaret's arthritis was getting worse. Time was catching up with them, as it catches everyone. "But this," Margaret gestured to the museum, "this will outlive us. Long after we're gone, people will still come here, still stand in front of these paintings, still feel what we felt when we first saw them. We're going to die, but we're leaving something behind that matters." "That's what Nathaniel did," Henry said. "He died, but his love for beauty survived, and now it's going to survive us too." The next morning, Margaret woke early and drove to the mansion alone. She had a key that let her in before the staff arrived, before the crowds. She walked through the empty galleries in the pre-dawn quiet. Her footsteps, the only sound. In Nathaniel's restored study, she sat at his desk, the actual desk, where he'd written his journals, where he'd planned his preservation scheme, where he'd died, believing his treasures would stay hidden forever. She pulled out a pen and paper and began to write. Not a journal entry, not a letter, a message to whoever came after her, whoever would run this museum when she and Henry were gone. To the future trustees of the Blackwood Heritage Foundation, my name is Margaret Walsh. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. But I wanted to leave you with some thoughts about what we built here and why it matters. This museum exists because one man loved beauty enough to hide it from those who would destroy it. It exists because my husband and I were stubborn enough to fight when everyone told us to give up. It exists because an elderly woman named Catherine chose truth over family. It exists because hundreds of people, donors, volunteers, workers, believers, contributed their time, money, and faith to something bigger than themselves. But it exists, more than anything, because of you, the future trustees reading this, the directors and curators and guards and educators who will continue this work long after I'm forgotten. You are the ones who will carry this forward. You are the ones who will decide if Nathaniel's dream survives another century. Please remember, this is not a business. This is not an investment. This is a promise that beauty matters, that art is not decoration, but evidence of humanity's capacity for transcendence, that some things are worth protecting even when it costs everything. Keep the admission free. Let anyone who wants to see beauty be able to see it, rich or poor, educated or not, young or old. Don't let money determine who gets to experience wonder. Fight for it. When politicians want to cut funding, when developers want the land, when anyone tries to diminish what we've built, fight. The way we fought, the way Nathaniel fought. And remember that the most valuable things in this museum aren't the paintings or sculptures. They're the faces of the children seeing art for the first time, the tears of the elderly finding unexpected joy, the transformation that happens when people understand they're capable of creating and appreciating beauty. That's what this is about. That's what it's always been about. Don't forget. Don't let anyone forget. With hope and faith that you'll do better than we did, Margaret Ann Walsh. She folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in the desk's locked drawer. Someday, maybe years from now, someone would find it. And maybe, like Nathaniel's letters, it would remind them why they were fighting. The museum opened at 10. By 9:30, the line was already forming. Margaret watched from the porch as families arrived, as school buses pulled up, as people from across the country came to see what an elderly couple and a heartbroken recluse had preserved. Henry found her there, brought her coffee the way she liked it. "You okay?" he asked. "Better than okay," Margaret replied. "I was just thinking about all the things that had to happen for us to be standing here, all the choices and chances, and moments that led to this. Fate?" Henry asked. "Maybe. Or maybe just the universe rewarding stubborn people who refuse to give up on broken things." They stood together, watching the crowd, watching life flow into the building they'd saved. And Margaret thought about treasure, not the kind measured in dollars, but the kind measured in transformed lives, in preserved beauty, in dreams that survived beyond death. She thought about how she and Henry had been broke, struggling, invisible, how they'd bought a mansion everyone else rejected, how they'd found what was hidden and fought to share it, how they'd taken a century-old man's desperate act of preservation and turned it into a living legacy. She thought about courage, and how it looked different than people imagined, not loud or flashy, but quiet and persistent. The courage to try when success seems impossible. The courage to care when cynicism would be easier. The courage to believe that beauty and truth still matter in a world obsessed with profit. "You know what the best part is?" Margaret said. "What's that? We're just two ordinary people. We didn't have money or power or connections. We just had stubbornness and love for something beautiful. And it was enough. That was enough." Henry squeezed her hand. "Maybe that's the real treasure we found. Not the paintings or the money. The knowledge that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they're willing to try." The doors opened. The crowd flowed in, filling the galleries with voices and laughter and wonder. Somewhere in that crowd was probably another little girl who'd stand transfixed in front of a Monet. Another elderly person finding unexpected joy. Another life being quietly transformed by beauty they never thought they'd see. And that, Margaret thought, was worth everything. Worth all of it. Because anyone can change the world if they're brave enough to believe in what everyone else has given up on. Margaret and Henry Walsh had bought a cursed mansion for $2,800 and found $300 million hidden beneath its floors. But the real treasure wasn't the art. It was the proof that hope matters, that courage counts, that ordinary people can protect extraordinary things. It was the knowledge that even when everything seems lost, even when darkness has fallen, beauty can be preserved, dreams can survive. And sometimes, if you're stubborn enough and brave enough to pry up the floorboards and look beneath the surface, you'll find that treasure has been waiting there all along. Not just waiting to be found, waiting for the right people to find it. Waiting for people who understand that some things are worth more than money. People who know that the greatest treasures aren't the ones you keep for yourself, but the ones you share with the world. As the sun climbed higher over Willow Creek, Margaret and Henry walked through their museum one more time, past the Renoirs and Monets and Degas, past the sculptures and jewelry and ancient artifacts, past all the beauty that Nathaniel Blackwood had loved enough to hide, and that they had loved enough to fight for. They walked hand in hand, two elderly people who'd taken the biggest risk of their lives and been rewarded beyond measure. Not with wealth, though technically they were wealthy now, but with purpose, with meaning, with the knowledge that they'd done something that mattered. And when they reached the main gallery, where Eleanor and Sarah Blackwood smiled from their garden painting, Margaret whispered one last thank you to the man who'd made it all possible. "We kept your promise, Nathaniel. Your collection lives, your dream lives, and it always will. Because we proved that beauty can survive anything, even a century of darkness, if someone cares enough to bring it into the light." The end. Up next, two more powerful stories that will move you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the greatest treasures are found by those brave enough to look where others have given up.